Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. My name is Tariq, and I'm Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow. So today we're going to be talking about labor strikes and union organizing and their roles in mobilizing Palestinians across the socio-political spectrum, both in Palestine and abroad. It goes without saying that throughout history, labor strikes have been used as a potent tool in expressing dissent, voicing grievances, and ultimately demanding political change. In Palestine, from the Great Revolt of 1936 to the coordinated workers' strikes of the Unity Intifada that we saw in 2021, strikes continue to represent a powerful mode of resistance and a critical source of leverage, not only for workers, but for Palestinians as a whole. They have encompassed diverse sectors, including labor, education, healthcare, and many more, showcasing the unity and determination of the Palestinian people in their struggle for liberation. They've also mobilized Palestinians across the diaspora, laying the foundation for the intersectional grassroots movement that is translating into growing support for the Palestinian cause around the world. So in today's Policy Lab, we're going to look back at this history of organizing, examine how it shaped the Palestinian struggle, where it worked and where it didn't work, and explore how it informs and continues to inspire the advocacy efforts of Palestinians wherever they are, whether they're in Palestine or throughout the diaspora abroad. We'll also discuss the intersections between labor rights and political resistance, the impact of strikes on local communities and international solidarity, and the challenges faced by workers in their quest for justice amid a deeply entrenched occupation. So we have a lot to talk about as usual, and never enough time to answer all the questions, but to begin to get started on answering some of these questions, I'm joined by Sumaya Awad and Jamal Juma. Sumaya is a Palestinian writer and organizer based in New York City. She is the director of strategy at the Adala Justice Project and co-editor of Palestine, a Socialist Introduction. Jamal is coordinator of the Palestinian grassroots anti-apartheid wall campaign, Stop the Wall, secretariat member of the BDS National Committee, the BNC, and executive committee member of the New Unions. So just a quick reminder before we get started about the event format. I'll be posing questions for the first 40 or so minutes, and then we'll save about 15 or 20 minutes at the end to get to questions from the audience. Please feel free to submit your questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions you find particularly interesting or important. And we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible with the time we have. So without further ado, let's get started. So for Jamal, I wanted to start with you. The history of labor strikes in Palestine is a very long one. Can you start off this discussion by just giving us a brief historical background on the role labor strikes have played in Palestinian resistance throughout history and what they look like today?
Give the back really very rich history, and it takes really more time to shed light on the different junctions of the workers' struggle and also their engagement in the political issue. The trade unions, the labor movement in Palestine in general, before the Nakba, talking about it, we can divide it into two stages. The first one from 1920 to 30, it was in very beginning, and it was shaping in a way and defining the identity of the labor movement. And the second one from 1930 to 1948, which became more organized, and it takes really the leading role of the unions in the class and national studies as well. The beginning of 20s, the only labor organization formed that time was the Histadrut. It was established in 1920, which is the Zionist labor organization. That time, the Palestinian Communist Party was very active, and he was, in fact, encouraging the Arab workers to join the Histadrut from the perspective that he's calling for the struggle for the establishment of the United International Trade Unions movement. After more than 1 year of procrastination, the Histadrut leadership agreed to include the Arab workers in its rank. But it was clearly for the Arab workers, the discrimination there between the workers workers and the Jewish workers, different ranges between in the wages as well. That led at the beginning of 25 that the Arab workers, especially of the railway, which consists of 400 Arab workers from Haifa, Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Lod as well, to decide to withdraw from Histadrut and seek to establish its own trade union. That time it was supported also by Al-Istiqlal party, it's a political party. And this was because also that this union, the majority of the workers was Arabs or Palestinians, but the leadership of the union remains in the hands of the Jewish workers. As a result of this and the work that happened around that, the Association of the Arab Workers established in 1922 in Haifa, which this organization mainly remains the main organization that led the struggle of the workers until the Nakba almost. But at that period, and when we talk about the 20s, there are also many workers' societies has been established. Like in 23, in Nablus, it was formed the Arab Workers' Party. And that was succeeded to attract a number of workers from the soup and craft workers as well. In 1927, Christian Workers Association in Jaffa established as a labor organization. That time there is a party called Palestine Free Party. Also, it begins in 28 to form also a number of trade union organizations. In Nazareth and Haifa also, these cities in 1928, they held a conference of the Christian workers in Nazareth, headed by that time by Rev. Marcos Abdel Masih. During also the same period in 28, another organization attempt for another union, which is organized by the Arab workers in Haifa, from the perspective of Islamic religious organization, and that was led by one of the Islamist families in Haifa at that time. So this is like the 20s. It's looking like the workers has been from different Palestinian cities. We're looking for their identity. So that's we see the ranging between the religious and national Arab nationalism, and also the communists and the leftists. In 1993, the Arab Workers Association that we talk about held its first general conference for the Arab workers in Haifa. It was 61 delegates representing almost 3,000 workers in 9 branches from the cities of Haifa, Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Akka, Nazareth, Lod, Shafa Amr, and many others as well. So this was the first the organized conference that it come up with also a kind of a vision and a strategy. That conference, it took some 30 general decisions and about 30 special decisions for the real workers. Most of these decisions has been dealt with the conditions of the employment of the workers, and others deals with other general and professional and political aspects. Among of that, for example, and this is what shows how it engaged in the politics, the first decision was denouncing the Zionist immigration to Palestine. Then also they decided to issue a newspaper under the name of the Arab workers, but they, at the last minute, they was just cancel it, afraid or fearing that the British that time will consider it connected to Moscow at the time with the British mandate government fighting the communists' activities. Then also another one, which is establishing a saving fund for workers. This fund has been lasted from 30 to 36 until the biggest strike, and they start using the fund and the whole mobilization to support the strike in Palestine, the big strike that time. This organization, the Palestinian Arab Workers Association, carried an extensive trade unions activity to defend the right of the workers, represented in series of strikes in the years 1927, 33, and 35. The association was established to achieve a set of trade unions achievement for workers, most notably increasing, for example, the labor wages, which they succeed in this partially, regulating, for example, the sick, religious, and holidays leaves, some of which were full-time paid and full paid and half paid, making the working days 8 hours, like any, and in all major companies except the port for 9 hours. And this shows like how this association became very organized and stick to the two things: the national struggle and also the workers' class struggle. The association were very active and involved in the strike in 1936. They established committees around the country that time that was in charge of organizing the masses, providing aids and sponsor the counter propaganda of the Zionists and also the British that time. Labor activity in Palestine and within the long strike has been in a way declined. It's became much more like engaged in the political issue, and also the assassination of Michel Mitri, who was at that time the head of the Arab Workers Association in Jaffa in December 1936, also helped in weakening the movement. That's come along with also the British targeted the leaders of the unions, and they arrested a lot of their numbers from and leaders from different Palestinian cities as well. We can say that in 1939, the life revived again in the offices of the Palestinian Arab Workers Association, and also new unions started to form and establish and join also the Arab Association, including, for example, British Army Camps Workers Union, the Telegram Post and Telephone Workers Union, Public Workers Department Union, the British Commercial Sibney Company Workers Union, and Petroleum Refining Company Workers Union. So they get out really again strongly in organizing, and the workers became, after the strike, you see the importance of the unionizing, let's say. At this stage, like the association also organized series of comprehensive strikes, most notably the strike for equal wages between the Arab and Jewish workers, which was going in strikes throughout 1942, 1943. And it has succeeded in a way or another to achieve some of its objective, if not all. The general labor strike in April 1946, in a protest against the refusal of the head of the British Post, Telegram and Telephone Department in Jaffa to recognize the Palestinian Arab Workers Association as a representative of the workers. Then also another big strike was for the workers of Al-Sadiq Quarries against the Zionist Soleil Bonnet Company. And the strike was characterized by the workers, even they were preparing an armed groups to protect the workers that time, because they were fearing from the Zionist attacks on the workers themselves. Another thing that also was in this conflict between the Histadrut and the Arab society, that the association were able to prevent the Histadrut from organizing a strike in the workers for the workers of the British Army camp. That was in October 43. So that they cannot prove their claims that to be the legitimate representatives of the working class in Palestine. I mean, the Histadrut, to prevent Histadrut. Other thing that became they also go to the universality, like the society succeeded to participate in the first International Trade Union Conference in London in February, from the 6th to 22nd of February 1945. And the delegation made every effort to refute the idea of the national home for Jews in Palestine, and to refute also the argument of the Histadrut that representative who tried to speak on behalf of the Arab and Jewish workers in Palestine. The society also participated for the second time in the International Trade Union in that conference that was held in Paris in September, after like 6-7 months, in September 1945. Then the second conference that held by the society was in Haifa also in August 1946. This conference even witnessed a progressive and the progress in the work of the society, witnessing intellectual and political development in building the association and its objectives. It includes representatives of 42 branches, and this shows how much like the unions were very spread out all over Palestine, and total number of 50 representatives and 53 observers members. And the conference summarizes the principle of the association as following. Is consider the trade union movement as the right way to reach the socialist goals. The second, consider the way to reach the socialist goals as the way to development, not revolution. The third, consider our socialism within the scope of reform movement to achieve social justice by equitably distributing the country's natural and productive wealth. The fourth, also consider the political movement as a branch of the mother trade union movement and as a mean to reach and end goals, goals of liberation, of course. Then it came the third conference, which is held in 1947, and it includes 120 trade unionists, representing nearly 120,000 workers, and focused on the defining the position of the labor movement on the question of Palestine. That's mainly what they're about. So they decide in this regard, like rejecting of the principle of dividing Palestine, and also the calling for the establishment of the democratic Palestinian state, and considering also the third one, considering the Arab Jews who inhabited Palestine before 1918 and those who descended from them as citizens with rights and duties. And for everyone who entered Palestine without the desire of its people will be evacuated from Palestine. So we see that's mostly it's about, and we know that in 47 it was the whole political situation were heated, and so many attacks was on the Palestinian villages. The Zionist movement were very aggressive against the Palestinians. So it's like mostly it's about the Palestinian identity and what's their strategies. And unfortunately, this conference was the last Arab trade union demonstration in Palestine before the Nakba, which is after the Nakba, everything collapsed, like the national movement, the labor movement, the society, everything, as all of you know. So then here, that's the second stage, which is come after the Nakba, which is after the collapsing of the national and labor movement. The Arab Workers Association was moved to Nablus at that time, and the unions began in 1954 to reform workers as a workers' committees, like because also that was under the Jordanian ruling the West Bank, and the Jordanians were like repressing the workers' movement because it was led mainly by the communists and the Communist Party that time, and the trade unions leaders was like also very active in the Communist Party, and it's known the identity of the unions. So many of them has been taken to jail for long years, something like 15 or more in Al-Jafar in Jordan. Many of them deported to other areas, and they became chased and wanted everywhere. So almost their work became like mostly political, and they didn't have the chance to organize for the workers' rights or for the trade unions as it should be. Then it came the period after 1967. Here it's like after 67, the unions began to be active again. And in some 3-4 years, it's already like 8 trade unions were formed in various sectors, which were organized also organized into what they call it, the Palestinian General Federation of the Trade Unions, which is until now, it has the same name, but there is many, if you want to talk about the period. And also that time it was led by the communists and the leftists in general, because later on started to, after the establishment of other leftist Palestinian parties, leftist parties like PFLP, DFLP, they join the union locally here on the ground. But the main activists, because most of the other Palestinian political parties and they were like focused on the outside. So the communists were like focusing on trade unions and the youth federation and so on. Mm-hmm. In 1973, that's what is very significant, which is the federation held its conference and decided to recognize that PLO as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and demand that the Arab world recognize that as well. Here, the Israeli occupation authorities began a campaign of oppression and arrest so many of the trade unions, chasing them everywhere, deported even outside the country. Some of them returned back just after Oslo. Deported many of their key leaders of the movement and jailed the others. So they became engaged strongly in both, in fact, and that's the class struggle. They will continue organizing, and also the political, while they were also chased and attacked by the Israelis. They didn't forbid the work of the unions, but they were chasing them. And the base, as I said, became much more clear in this time, that it has been based on the national struggle, and the class struggles became much more clear in this. And then after that, it became the problems of the workers' movement. In 1980, for example, Fatah demanded the leadership of the federation, as they are the biggest party, but they don't have majority in the union itself. There's even not close to the majority. So it has been refused. In 81, they split the union, and they took even the headquarters, and they take the same name as well, and the same phone numbers. So it became, there's two unions now with the same name, the BGFTU. One became more any leftist identity, and one for Fatah. But the main active one was, and the one more established, is the one belonged to the leftists. Unfortunately, in 85 also, the Democratic Front split and established its own federation. So it became also added another trade union. Here it comes the first Intifada. The first Intifada, everything became totally engaged in the work on the ground. So there is no more for competitions between the federations, and everybody became strongly engaged in the activities of the Intifada. Until 1990, which is that time where Abu Ammar were calling the leaders of the different political parties, and they told them it's not right that all Palestinians are fighting in the Intifada, and we have all this number of trade unions, we have to unify this. So they had a meeting, and they in 1990, and they unified the trade unions in the BGFTU, the same name, but it was on political basis. So they divided in political basis. 3 members for Fatah, 3 members for the Communists, 3 members for the Popular Front, etc. And it became, in a way, they had been taken out the workers rule in this, and it became more political, and that's how it has been start functioning. But that was supposedly for 1 year, and the second year, 1991, they should have an election. Unfortunately, election didn't happen, and they meet again, and they decide that they will continue with the same category, just political parties participating and sharing the union. Unfortunately, it's until now the BGFTU is the same, is led by the political parties. So this has been come over the workers' work, and focusing on the workers' issues, and weaken, in fact, the labor movement in Palestine.
Jamal, if I could pause you right here, just because you're entering a question I want to ask a little bit later. But if I could just put you on pause for a second, and turn the attention a little bit right now to Sumaya. When we'll come back to kind of where Jamal is leaving off in the 90s. But Sumaya, I just wanted to note, since the Palestinian experience is in so many ways characterized by fragmentation, and millions of Palestinians live in the diaspora, millions of Palestinians live around the world. How have these strikes and this labor organizing at this point that Jamal has gotten us to, have they influenced the perspectives and the tactics of the international solidarity movement?
Thanks, Tariq, and thanks, Jamal, for laying all that out. I feel like all the history that that Jamal just laid out, and just to the 90s, is something that I would argue probably 80%, and I'm being generous, I think, of Palestinians, certainly in the US, are not familiar with. And I think it's reflected in how difficult it has been to organize here in the US in the labor movement, both because a lot of this really rich labor history, which points to the fact that you can't separate class struggle from the Palestinian struggle, is not how a lot of the organizing is not the perspective that a lot of the organizing has taken. Not all, but a lot of it. And I think that's no surprise. I mean, Jamal just described the onslaught on labor organizing in Palestine. What happened to trade unionists? What happened to workers' committees? Both from Israel and the occupation, and then also from the ruling class in Palestine and the different iterations of that over time. And I start with this because I think right now what we're seeing, I'm going to sort of jump from the 90s, but right now what we're seeing in the US, and I'm going to focus on the US context, is that there's a shift in this. I think increasingly people are starting to intuitively reach the conclusion that actually to create any sort of change in Palestine, we need system change. And what that means is we need to be thinking about class. And we need to think about class struggle and not about simply replacing our oppressors with a new rung of society that is also oppressing us. And I think, that means, and it's a lot more than just ending Israel's occupation, but what it means to fight for a free Palestine in every sense of the word. And that means thinking about material change that's rooted in economic and political systems that aren't just serving to elevate the upper rungs of society, right, the ruling class, the middle class, but are actually tackling questions of poverty and refugees beyond just taking international aid and sort of throwing it at places and of course the corruption that comes with that. So it's, I think, the question of national struggle and class struggle and how do they intersect and where does one end and the other begin have increasingly been topics of discussion in the Palestine solidarity movement internationally and then also in the US. And the US is far behind other countries around the world when it comes to labor organizing for Palestine. So in the UK, there's a much stronger presence of workers organizing for Palestine. Obviously in the Middle East as well. Tunisia is one of the biggest examples of trade unions and Palestine solidarity in the last 30 to 40 years. And the US is behind, and partly because the US labor movement is incredibly weak. It has been, since the 70s. It was once very strong and has sort of had a really sharp decline. But we're seeing an uptick. In 2018, 2019, there was a large uptick with teacher strikes. There's something about teachers, right? Because there's a teacher strike in Palestine as well. There's teacher strike in Jordan, teacher strike in the US. Teachers hold a lot of power. And then in the last year, in 2022, there was also an uptick of strike activity in the US. There's 52% uptick, actually. And so there's this resurgence is a strong word, but I'm going to use it. There's a resurgence of labor in the US. And I think there's all these opportunities for how do we think about anti-imperialism in these labor struggles, in these strikes in the US, whether it's Amazon and Google workers or Starbucks workers or, and the list goes on, teachers, like the famous example of 2018. And I think all of this is really important because, and I think Jamal is probably about to talk about this, so I will only touch on it and not go into detail, because otherwise, if we're not approaching it through class struggle, if we're not approaching it through, well, what is the power of workers who can actually shift society because they build society and they reproduce society every day, then we run into the pitfalls of capitalism, like the IMF and the World Bank, and the many things they try to implement as countries are going from, stages of national struggle to becoming independent nation states, independent. And we saw attempts of this in Palestine with the Palestinian Reform and Development Plan, the PRDP, which was sort of under the guise of development and more economic independence. It instead just privatized a lot of industries and led to a pretty sharp spike in poverty and also kind of laid the groundwork for what the US's plan was and probably still is for the Middle East, which is to create a single economic zone across the Middle East, right, from Morocco to the Gulf. And Palestine plays a role in that because you can have Palestinian workers work in qualified industrial zones where they have absolutely no rights and can't do anything about it. There's no way to organize because it's not technically any particular territory. And then you have these giants like Walmart and Gap and other corporations go there and just have cheap labor with no real way to protest it. I would love to go into this more, but I won't, and I suspect Jamal might talk about it later on, but if not, we can also get to it in the Q&A. And I'll just end, I don't know if I've gone over time, but I'll end by saying that I think one thing the Unity Intifada did in 2021 was that it was sort of a reminder of the ways in which class struggle, and so calling for a strike, even if the majority of workers didn't participate, but something that can unite all Palestinians from the river to the sea is a very, very, very powerful tool. And it goes beyond, it's symbolic, of course, and it was symbolic to see, Palestinians in Gaza in 48 in the West Bank, but then also in Jordan and in Lebanon and in the US stand together over something, and that it was something called from the bottom up. It was not from the top down, and it was around. It was like an economic call, right? It was about economic power. And that hadn't been seen in decades. And that was so incredibly powerful. And I think the effects of that are still lingering, at least here in the US and the Palestine movement. And I think there's a lot that particular action and call that spurred in labor organizing in the US. And I will give examples in a little bit.
Thank you, Sumaya. So Jamal, turning back to you, Sumaya discusses, I think it's interesting that Sumaya brought up economic power. And my question for you is to kind of bring us back to where you left off with the historical background is, during the first Intifada, Israel's economy was a lot more dependent on Palestinian labor than it is today. So in other words, Palestinian laborers, Palestinian workers had a lot more economic power behind them. So my question is, how do today's labor strikes, for example, the strikes during the Unity Intifada in 2021, or anything that's ongoing right now, how do they impact Israelis as occupiers? And I guess the question is, do Palestinians have the same level of economic power and leverage that they once had?
About the first Intifada, where we had full occupation and Israel is responsible over the Palestinian, what's called occupied territories. So in fact, at the beginning, in the first early stages, like between 67 until the 87, Israel was benefiting totally from its occupation. It was very easy occupation, very profitable. The revenues from the occupied territories in 67 was the largest contribution to the expansion of the Israeli economy. Like 30% to 35% of the Arab labor force is used in Israel, meaning that the source of 19% of the outpost of the West Bank and 33% of the outpost of Gaza Strip is labor in Israel. The trade in goods and services also, that's like something really huge, which is like any surplus of export from this sector in this period that I was talking about, in the 16 years or more, is about 2,400 million added for the Israeli economy. You are talking about $2.5 billion. The same, like even like the different wages between the Arab workers and the Jewish workers, which is like the big range, and this is almost saved about in this period time is about $3 billion something million dollars for the Israeli also treasury. If you want to talk directly about away from this, from the numbers, but go direct to the damages that has been that was caused by the first Intifada, and particularly it's from boycotting the workers, like not going to their work, and also the boycott, because it boycott of the Israeli products, and also how it's affected the tourism and all the sectors. It's not just like one sector or something, but like most of the Israeli economy have been almost like stagnant, or like have been to 1989 became like in a very bad shape. Just like maybe like would shed light on 5 main sectors like that has been affected because of the first Intifada, and mainly that the problem of the labor. Let's say talk about the construction workers. This is the biggest like workers that the sectors that the Palestinian workers were contributing to or were working on. That's where the biggest damage has been in the Israeli economy. For example, the construction sector, almost about 50,000 workers like working in the sector, constituting 63% of the total number of the workers in the sector. The total losses in this sector is about $500 to $600 million a year, and this was the statistics from the first year, 1988. The agriculture sector also. This sector was depending in large extent on the Arab labor force, and it's estimated like from just like the losses from the citrus fruit and the packaging is about 169 million in a half a year. Like in total, about like per year, it's also about 400 to 500 million dollars per year. The industrial sector a little bit less, and it consists only 6% of the total number of the workers, but also the impact is about like almost 62 million to 70 million during the first year, and it has accumulated on in the other years and became much more even worse. Tourism sector. The tourism sector is one of the most affected, in fact, because of the uprising, and most important of which due to the navigate repercussions that the uprising causes in the world public opinion on the image of Israel. So, and also the big losses of the incoming tourism, and that's where like caused around like $1 billion a year of losses, and it usually that this sector has earns to Israel around $1.6 billion a year. That was based on the statistics of 1987. The other thing also, the Israeli loss from taxes. The taxes, the estimation of the taxes were losses about 250 million during the first 15 months of the Intifada. We can calculate after that, and became the more that Intifada continued, the more these numbers became worse. And I would say that the most important result out of all this, it's like for the first time that Israel started to think of the whole issue of separation from the occupied territories. And that's what became one of the main debates. The Intifada shook the whole system that Israel established in the last 20 years in the West Bank. So, I would say I can't imagine based on these numbers, because the stagnation of the economy started in 1989, and without the support, the massive support from the United States, I think their economy will collapse based on this. And that's what there was no time to bring workers from outside, and it was a difficult issue. So this just to bring to my mind, if the Intifada has been continued and had been we didn't fall in the trap of the what's so-called the peace negotiations later, and that the PLO has been unfortunately falling in, how this can really go rapidly for achieving the Palestinian goals.
Thank you, Jamal. So I want to, with that, I want to kind of jump back to Sumaya and you, because Jamal kind of ended that answer with talking about the international support effect and kind of bolstering the Israeli economy and lessening the impact of the potential workers' strikes. So my question for you, Sumaya, is, labor movements are often intersected with other social justice movements abroad. And what I want to know is, how have Palestinian labor movements collaborated with other groups internationally to amplify their collective impact? And I guess, how does this impact international support for the Palestinian movement and the continuation of support of the the high level of support that Israel gets?
Yeah, I'm actually going to focus on a very specific example for this question that sort of shows the power of labor in tarnishing Israel's image internationally, and also sort of impacting its economic standing as well. And Israel has a very strong economic foundation at this point, right? I mean, I think some people have argued more recently that it doesn't even need the money it's getting from the US every year, that's more just that $3.8 billion is really nothing to Israel when you think about its growing economy, and that it's more of like what politically that means to have that. But I digress. What I want to talk about is the dock workers internationally, and the way they've organized around Palestine, and against Israel's occupation, and specifically against Israel's economic interests. And the first instance that we saw of this was in 2008, 2009, during the onslaught on Gaza, when there was a call from the BDS movement on dock workers internationally to refuse to load and offload Israeli ships. And who responded? South Africa. In South Africa, the Transport and Allied Workers Union, they responded. And it was in Durban. And it was the first time globally that an Israeli ship was not offloaded. And that sparked something where 5 years later, in 2014, during another onslaught on Gaza, in the US, in California, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, AROC, they took the call, the BDS call, and they organized a massive and very successful campaign, working with dock workers in the Bay Area to what they ended up calling the Block the Boat Coalition. And what they did is they blocked the Israeli company Zim from offloading at the port in Oakland, California. And that actually inspired other dock workers across the US to follow suit and have similar actions. And in 2014, when this was so successful, Zim actually said that, they were just not going to offload any ships in US ports anymore, permanently. They tried again in 2021, and it coincided with the Unity Intifada and yet another onslaught on Gaza. And organizers showed up, and again, they blocked them. And this is really powerful. And the reason I mentioned this particular example of dock workers is because, there's a question of why dock workers? It's such a specific niche thing. Of course, they have a very, very strong union. But I think part of the reason that they were so successful with dock workers is that the Longshoremen Union has this history of standing with the oppressed that predates Palestine. So they refused to offload ships in protest of Japanese internment in California. They refused to offload ships in support of the civil rights movement. They refused to offload ships and went on strike during the Black Lives Matter uprising in the summer of 2020. And they also did a similar action during apartheid South Africa, and the list goes on. There's this great quote from Angela Davis where she says, "Whenever the ILWU, which is the Longshore Workers Union, takes a stand, the world feels the reverberations," end quote. And I think that's just such a powerful quote about the power of workers to make the world stop, right? And that's what hits Israel and any other country that we are trying to protest, that we are trying to end its oppression of X or Y people. That's what hits them hardest. And I think that's why BDS is so powerful. I mean, in this case of the longshore workers, they were responding to a BDS call. And what BDS does, it's so much more than just a symbolic a symbolic or moral stance, because what BDS is targeting is the economic stability of, this apartheid structure, of this colonial project. And that's what makes it so powerful. And I think that's what makes BDS, at the heart of BDS, it is incorporating class struggle. It is anti-capitalist. It is saying that we need to think beyond just national struggle, and think about what we're trying to build, and think about where the power lies and how do we want to take that power and harness it, in order to end these systems of oppression. And I think I'll end with this. One of the most powerful aspects of this is that it really affirms and highlights and underlines a million times that workers around the world have more in common with one another than they do with the ruling classes, with the governments ruling over them and oppressing them. And I think that's what we're trying to. Those are the arguments we're making in the labor movement here in the U.S. Right? That as workers here in the U.S., whether you're at Google or you're at Amazon or you're a teacher in West Virginia, you have more in common with Palestinian workers rising up against Israel than you do with the rulers in your country and with the ruling class in your country.
Thank you, Sumaya. So we have not too much time left, and I do want to save some time for audience questions. So if anyone does have any questions, I know we have a couple in the chat, but if anyone has any other questions, now is a great time to throw them in, and we'll see if we can answer them. But before that, I just want to turn back to Jamal and kind of end it and just very briefly on how you envision the future of labor strikes in Palestine, and what are the key areas that need to be improved for the sustained success of the Palestinian labor movement, and then any other questions we can try to fit them in at the end.
And the labor movements nowadays, they are really, or than the last, like after Oslo, it became in a very bad shape, let's say. And it's like totally, as I said before, it has been dominated by the political parties. And that was just like put away all the class struggle and also the workers' rights. That's why, and has been explained that we don't have even in the West Bank, in the Palestinian Authority, until now we don't have courts for workers, labor courts. We don't have minimum wages. There is, but it's not implied in any way. There is no social security. There is it's a disaster, the situation of the workers here. And in spite of, as what I started to talk about, we have more than 6 trade unions that started it. So we have to liberate the trade unions from the domination of the political parties and making it working for this as if it is for their own purposes. If we go to the other trade unions, like the teachers' trade union. Teachers' trade union was striking for more than three months, and they are demanding any dignity, just minimum wages that they can really survive. The authority just did all the efforts just to destroy their strike, from trying to split this, to attack them in media campaigns and social media campaigns. It's threatening so many of them and ignoring their demands at all. And that shows the weakness of the trade unions, that there's no solidarity from other unions in general with the teachers' union. So they have been left alone in their struggle for the teachers' rights. And that's unfortunately what's happening. The different unions, when they start their own strikes, either the doctors or others, they have been left alone, and then it was enabled in way or another the authority to fail and to oppress the strike. So here, and this goes back also, and the reasons is also the political situation that we have, the domination of the authority in the West Bank and as well in Gaza as well, and from their side it's not any better from this human rights sense as well. So it doesn't leave any room for the unions to act as normally as supposed to be for their rooms. But that comes also because they are really afraid. They are really panicking when there are any strikes, when any movements come in, and inside and start working and start moving. They became panicking from where it has to go. So the first thing like this is we need to liberate the movement. At the same time, there is a responsibility on the political parties to understand this, and without like letting like the space for the trade unions to work as they should. There is no way for also do any progressive and development in the political issues as well, because if we look back to the history of the trade unions, we saw how much they were like central in the struggle of the Palestinians since early 20s. I would say that there is also an attempt like from trade unions to rebel against this. And this is like the example of like the forming of the new Federation of New Unions that has been led a strike for 6 months in one of the factories, in the Israeli factories, in fact. And they try to get a help, even from their union, the BGFTU, from the Ministry of Labor, from other NGOs, from other labels. They have been left alone in the strike. But they continue, and they were really initiated a very amazing ways how to support themselves. Like it went that they take a loan from the bank and to support the workers that they are striking. They were shifting 3 shifts, day and night, closing the factory to ensure that they will not bring other workers to work in this factory. Until after 6 months, it has been fall apart. And they were at the same time having a court case against the factory. And the strike started like because they were asking for minimum wages. They were taking slavery wages, 40 shekels a day. Like, and while the minimum wages in Israel is reach above 250 shekels a day. Beside all the safety regulation, there is nothing. Even toilets they don't have in this factory. And this is the situation in the other factories as well. So at the end, they were succeeded. They succeed even in the case court case, and they get like any kind of compensation for the workers about 7 million shekels. It's about $2 million for 95 workers in this 6 months, and they were forced the new investor of the factory to implement the Israeli labor law, which raises the wages until the minimum wage. And that's where they decide when they finish this, do we want to continue with labor that they don't like take any responsibility or any support for our main struggle? That's what they should do in the heart of the work of the unions. So they decide to form a new federation, and they called it New Unions. And they focused again, like I think, on the national struggle and class struggle, which has been absent in the last 20 years from the agendas of the trade unions. And from 2010 until now, they were holding the second conference, and they are now over 20,000 members, and they have 37 unions all over the West Bank, so have been spreading widely on their own capacities. They didn't get any penny from outside as a donation. It's just like their own capacity. So this is a kind of like a hope, like examples, like that shows that there is a dynamics within the workers. They are not happy about what's happening, and they are feel bad about this situation. You have like 300,000 workers almost that have no rights, like either from the Israeli factories or from the Palestinian as well. Mm-hmm. So there is a long way of struggle, and to be honest, without like organizing and getting the workers like work in dignity and just giving them the space to be engaged in their issues, like either national or also class struggles, I think we are not going to go anywhere. This is a gap in our situation now. Yeah. We saw the important role of the unions in the first Intifada. We saw it all over the last decade as well. Mm-hmm. So we can learn the lessons. That's what we are missing. This is a major part of our people. Mm-hmm. And in fact, like when you talk about our economy today, it's based mainly on the wages of the workers that we are working mainly in Israel, which has become like hostages in the Israeli market. And that's preventing any development because the authority don't have any real plans of development and don't want to do that. In fact, many unfortunately, when you talk about teachers, so many teachers is leaving the teaching and go to work in Israel. And I think this became in way or another like and hidden goal, like, okay, that's going to work in Israel will bring much more money to the West Bank. So that's why maybe the authority is not really willing to solve this problem for the teachers.
Thank you, Jamal. So, Sumaya, I want to end with you, and Jamal, you make an important point about the need to refocus labor organizing around the class struggle and around the national struggle, and remove it from the control of factions and political parties and so on and so forth. Sumaya, can I ask you the same question about what you see the future of labor organizing around Palestine looking like in the U.S. and considering the kind of the gloomy outlook that you noted at the beginning, and kind of answering the same question that Jamal answered, what is needed for the movement itself to be successful in the future?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two main points. The first is that part of what you need for it to be successful is a labor movement that exists in the U.S. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's growing and that's very exciting. And that's where we've seen some of the most inspiring campaigns in the last couple of years, connecting Palestine and labor. So a couple quick examples. There's Sierra Club, which is the largest environmental org in the U.S., with thousands and thousands of members, and the workers in Sierra Club, they're unionized, and they just passed a resolution after 2 years of organizing. In June, they passed a resolution affirming their commitment to Palestine and also committing to investigating any union funds in Israel. And this was a tremendous victory against many obstacles in their way. And then, of course, there's the No Tech for Apartheid campaign, which is Amazon and Google workers organizing within their unions against this big military contract between Amazon, Google, and Israel to share surveillance technology and the cloud services. And this is a small group of workers up against these giants, Google and Amazon. And so by no means is this going to be a campaign that wins tomorrow or next year. But I think it's sort of an example of what is possible. And the fact that workers are going up in these giant companies, these like Fortune 500 companies, like things like that haven't happened before. The fact that Amazon workers unionized, they haven't won a contract yet, but I think these are sort of unheard of in the last 50, 60 years. And that's really exciting. And the fact that Palestine is already part of the conversation, I think means something and gives me at least a lot of hope. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of this is happening in the aftermath of like the big financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then again of the financial crisis of COVID, right? Like so much of the union organizing that we're seeing in the strikes, some of it happened before COVID, but a lot of it happened during and after COVID. And so I think that's also indicative of how some of these big dents in economic stability globally, and certainly in the US, sort of give rise to workers' power. And I think that's what we're seeing. And so that's been very exciting. The Sierra Club win, I think, was an inspiring act. And then we have more and more union locals standing for Palestine, releasing statements and standing in support of Palestine, including when the teachers were on strike. I know several locals in the US sent statements of solidarity with the teachers, but I think this was like such a drop in the bucket. And the question is, how do we grow it? And that's what's exciting about it, is there's this resurgence in the Palestine movement here in the US of taking labor organizing more seriously and incorporating it as a priority, and not just putting it on the back burner, but seeing it as the way to shift things. That it's not just about shifts in Congress and in the policy world, but it's also about shifts within the working class in the US, and connecting the struggle for Palestine to the struggles here and seeing them as organically connected. And I think that's on the rise. And I think it's also because the left in the US is growing in strange ways. It ebbs and flows. But the fact that socialism is something that's talked about in the US openly, I think gives way for these conversations to happen and for class struggle to be more organically connected and part of the Palestine movement in the US.
Thank you. So it looks like we're already over time, and I really wish we could stay and discuss more. It's such an important topic, but unfortunately we have to let people go. Thank you both. Thanks both of our speakers for joining us today, and thanks to everyone for taking the time out of their undoubtedly busy days. But before we sign off, I'd just like to remind everyone that our Policy Labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabaka. So we would be very thankful for any contributions you can make. And if you're able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate button that should appear on your screens. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you, Jamal.
Thank you.
I hope we can continue this conversation some other time.
Thank you. Thank you.